Hey guys, welcome to Missing Chronicle. I'm glad you're here tonight. You work 16 hours each day inside the castle kitchen where your hands bleed continuously from washing iron pots in water, so cold it feels like knives against your skin, while your back develops permanent damage from carrying heavy loads of wood up steep stone stairs that seem designed to break the human body through repetition. At the end of each month, after all this labor that consumes your waking life and destroys your physical health, you receive exactly 2 pennies as your complete wage for 30 days of brutal work. This amount represents your entire earning capacity within the castle economic system. Yet to sleep near the kitchen fire each night, the only reliable source of warmth available anywhere in the servants' wing during the winter months, you must pay the kitchen master 3 pennies per week just for the privilege of lying on warm stone instead of freezing in hallways. 12 pennies per month to avoid the kind of cold that kills human beings through sustained exposure, while you earn only 2 pennies for the same period, creating an arithmetic gap so obvious that even illiterate servants understand immediately that they begin each month already owing 10 pennies simply for the act of sleeping in a place warm enough to survive. You will never break even under this system because the mathematics make it structurally impossible. You will never accumulate enough surplus to leave because the debt compounds faster than you can earn, and this arrangement is not some accident of economic mismanagement or oversight, but rather represents the system working exactly as those who designed it intended it to function. The castle employs 140 servants distributed across different zones of thermal access, with 80 of them working in the kitchens, sculleries, and bakeries where fires burn constantly for cooking purposes, while the remaining 60 work in the stables, outer yards, and along the walls where no fires exist except during emergencies. Every servant assigned to the kitchen wing must pay for access to residual fire warmth during sleeping hours, while every servant working in the outer yards simply freezes through the night with no option to purchase relief regardless of how much money they might somehow accumulate. 3 distinct thermal zones exist within the same building during the same winter under the same roof system, creating temperature differentials that determine not merely comfort levels, but actual mortality rates that vary by a factor of 10 depending on which part of the castle you serve. 3 distinct thermal zones exist within the same building during the same winter under the same roof system, creating temperature differentials that determine not merely comfort levels, but actual mortality rates that vary by a factor of 10 depending on which part of the castle you serve. These temperature measurements are not modern estimates or educated guesses, but rather precise figures documented in the household accounts of English castles between 1250 and 1350, where stewards recorded every expenditure with the kind of obsessive detail that modern accountants would recognize immediately. The Earl of Lancaster's personal steward, functioning essentially as the chief financial officer of a large economic enterprise, recorded coal purchases, fire locations, and servant wages with the precision of a banker managing investment portfolios, creating archives that historians can now analyze to reconstruct the exact thermal conditions of medieval domestic service. Coal allocated for heating the Great Hall, where nobles gathered, cost £40 per month, representing a massive expenditure on a single communal space used primarily for ceremonial functions and public dining. Coal for individual noble chambers required £12 per chamber per month, meaning a castle with 10 noble residents consumed 120 pounds of expensive imported fuel just for private bedroom heating. Coal for the kitchens totaled £18 per month, but this allocation was designated exclusively for cooking fires rather than servant comfort, creating a system where the same fire that roasted meat for noble tables could not legally warm the people who prepared that meat. No coal was ever allocated to servants' sleeping areas in any of the documented accounts, but instead there appears a separate and revealing line item that reads, "Payments received from kitchen servants for fire access, various amounts, collected by kitchen master," proving that the steward knew servants paid for warmth. The earl who employed the steward knew about this payment system, and everyone involved in castle administration understood perfectly well that servants paid more than they earned just to avoid freezing to death in the building where they worked. The account books proved definitively that this was not a situation born from ignorance or administrative oversight, but rather a consciously maintained accounting practice that extracted additional revenue from the poorest workers in the entire economic system. A kitchen servant's day began at dawn regardless of how little sleep they had managed to obtain the previous night. With your body waking on the stone floor near the kitchen fire, if you had successfully paid the required fee the evening before, or waking in the hallway outside the kitchen while shivering uncontrollably and unable to achieve any real sleep if you had failed to produce the necessary coins. Either way, regardless of your thermal state or level of exhaustion, you began physical labor immediately upon waking because kitchen work operated on a schedule determined by noble meal times rather than servant recovery needs. You carried water from the courtyard well through all weather conditions, making approximately 50 trips per day, with each bucket weighing 30 pounds when full, meaning you transported roughly 1,500 pounds of water vertically upstairs and across courtyards every single day, just as one component of your total work burden. You scrubbed iron pots using sand and lye soap that stripped skin from your hands through chemical action, leaving them perpetually raw and bleeding because you could never stop long enough for healing to occur before the next pot required cleaning. You turned massive spits over roaring fires that made the front of your body burn with excessive heat, while your back remained cold from the draft that swept through the kitchen, creating a bizarre state where you experienced both thermal extremes simultaneously depending on which direction you faced. You chopped vegetables for hours until your fingers developed permanent cramps that would persist into old age if you survived long enough to experience old age, working through pain that started as discomfort and gradually progressed to the kind of chronic agony that becomes your normal baseline state. You worked straight through the midday meal that nobles consumed in the Great Hall, receiving no break and no food during this period because servant feeding happened on a different schedule entirely. You worked through the evening meal that represented the main dining event of the aristocratic day, receiving only scraps afterward that might consist of bread too stale for noble consumption or meat too fatty to be served at high tables. You continued working until the kitchen fires were banked for the night, and all food preparation for the next day was completed, meaning 16 hours of continuous labor on normal days and 17 hours during feast days when special meals required additional preparation time. For all of this work that destroyed your body systematically over years of service, you earned exactly 2 pennies per month, which amounts to less than 1/10 of a penny per day when calculated on a daily wage basis. At nightfall, after the fires had been reduced to coals and the kitchen work was finally complete, you engaged in what the system called a negotiation with the kitchen master, though this term implied a reciprocal exchange that bore no resemblance to the actual power dynamics of the transaction. The kitchen master was himself merely another servant who earned 5 to 8 pennies per month, which was enough to survive without accumulating debt, but nowhere near enough to rise into a higher social class or accumulate significant savings. His power came not from his official wage or his position in the formal hierarchy, but rather from his control over access to the dying embers of kitchen fires during sleeping hours, making him a gatekeeper whose decisions determined whether other servants lived or died over the course of a winter. He decided who could sleep on the warm stones positioned within 10 feet of the hearth where residual heat remained strong enough to prevent hypothermia. He decided who could drape their bodies near the bread ovens that retained heat through the night, thanks to their thick stone construction and the previous day's baking. And he decided who would be forced to sleep in the hallway, where moisture from the courtyard well condensed on cold stone walls and froze into sheets of ice that created a glittering death trap for anyone forced to lie there for 6 hours. 3 pennies per week bought you a guaranteed spot on the floor within 10 feet of the coals where temperatures remained warm enough to allow actual sleep and prevent serious health deterioration. 1.5 pennies per week bought you a spot 15 feet away from the heat source where you could feel some warmth, but not enough to stop shivering, creating a middle ground between comfort and danger that many servants occupied when they had some money but not quite enough for the premium position. No payment at all meant assignment to the hallway, and the hallway meant no sleep because human bodies cannot relax into rest when experiencing the early stages of hypothermia. No sleep meant exhaustion that accumulated night after night until your cognitive function began to deteriorate. Exhaustion meant mistakes during work hours because sleep-deprived brains cannot maintain the attention required for kitchen work. Mistakes meant beatings from senior servants or the kitchen master himself. Because medieval labor management relied heavily on physical punishment to maintain productivity, beatings meant injuries ranging from bruises to broken bones depending on the severity of the mistake and the mood of the person administering discipline. Injuries meant you could not perform physical labor at the required intensity level. And not working meant you were turned out into the winter with no references and no prospects, because injured servants had no economic value in a system with unlimited replacement labor. The so-called negotiation was not really a negotiation in any meaningful sense, but rather a statement of non-negotiable terms delivered by someone with power to someone without it. Some servants attempted to navigate this system through borrowing money from other servants who had somehow managed to accumulate small savings despite the wage structure, with a typical transaction involving a loan of 5 pennies that would need to be repaid as 6 pennies over the next 3 months, creating an interest rate of 20% that was considered normal and even generous by medieval lending standards. But you still earned only 2 pennies per month regardless of your debt obligations, meaning that repaying 2 pennies per month to service the loan left you with nothing remaining for fire access fees during the repayment period. You froze for 3 months while paying back the debt that had allowed you to stay warm during the previous period, then borrowed again to survive the next winter because your wage never increased and your need for warmth remained constant, creating a cycle that repeated year after year. The interest charged on these loans was not extortionate when compared to commercial lending rates in medieval cities, where 20% was considered quite reasonable for unsecured personal loans, but normal interest on top of a wage structure deliberately designed to create chronic debt meant the debt compounded faster than any servant could possibly repay through honest labor. After 3 years of this cycle, a servant might owe 20 pennies in accumulated debt, while earning only 24 pennies total per year, creating a debt-to-income ratio that made repayment mathematically impossible without either a dramatic increase in wages or a complete forgiveness of debt, neither of which ever occurred. Some servants worked for 15 consecutive years without ever escaping fire debt despite paying back money every single month, because the interest accumulated faster than the principal decreased, and new borrowing became necessary each winter to avoid freezing. They died in service, still owing money to other servants or to the kitchen master, and in some documented cases their debts were transferred to their children if those children also worked in the castle, creating hereditary debt bondage that persisted across generations. This fire access payment system was not unique to one particularly cruel lord or one unusually exploitative castle, but rather existed in dozens of documented locations across England and northern France, appearing in household accounts from different regions, different time periods, and different noble families with such consistency that historians recognize it as standard practice rather than aberrant behavior. The household accounts of the Earl of Northumberland, carefully preserved in archives and studied by economic historians, show exactly the same pattern of servants paying for fire access during winter months while earning wages demonstrably less than the cost of that access. The accounts of the Bishop of Winchester's castle at Farnham include explicit line items for fire fees collected by the master cook from kitchen servants who wanted to sleep near the ovens. The accounts of Dover Castle, one of the largest and most important defensive structures in medieval England, show guards paying for access to the warming room located near the gatehouse forge where metalworking created residual heat that could be rented to soldiers who needed relief from night watches in freezing towers. Everywhere this system appears in documented records, the arithmetic remains identical in its basic structure. Wages too low to cover survival costs. fire access priced too high for servants to afford from regular earnings, and debt accumulation becoming inevitable for anyone who wanted to survive the winter without dying from sustained cold exposure. Historians who specialize in medieval labor economics have developed a specific term for this practice, calling it thermal rent extraction, to describe the way castle administrations extracted additional economic value from servants by charging them for access to warmth that was already being produced for other purposes, essentially creating a secondary market in waste heat. The servants who actually lived through this system and experienced it in their bodies every night did not use academic terminology or economic jargon, but instead called it simply winter, a single word that encompassed all the suffering, debt, negotiation, and survival that the cold season entailed. You could not simply refuse to pay the fire fees and choose to freeze as an act of defiance or a cost-saving measure, because human beings cannot sleep at 2 degrees Celsius for months at a time without experiencing severe medical consequences that lead to death. Your body enters the first stage of hypothermia when core temperature drops to approximately 4 degrees Celsius, and at 2 degrees Celsius sustained for weeks rather than hours. Your immune system begins to collapse as metabolic functions slow down and white blood cell production decreases. You develop respiratory infections because cold air damages the delicate tissues of your lungs and creates conditions where bacteria and viruses can thrive. You develop frostbite on your fingers, toes, ears, and nose. Essentially, any extremity that remains exposed to freezing air while you lie motionless trying to achieve sleep that never fully comes because your body keeps waking you to generate warmth through shivering. The frostbite progresses through stages, first causing pain and redness, then numbness and white or grayish skin, then blackening as tissue dies from lack of blood flow, and finally gangrene as the dead tissue becomes infected with bacteria that spread into healthy areas. Monastery physicians who served both religious communities and noble households documented this entire progression in medical texts written between 1200 and 1400, creating a literature of cold-induced injury that modern medical historians can study to understand medieval environmental disease. They called this condition winter rot, using terminology that emphasized the decay process rather than the cold that caused it. They knew it came from sustained cold exposure rather than from any internal disease or moral failing. And they knew it killed servants at rates far higher than it killed nobles who slept in heated chambers. They recommended amputation of blackened fingers and toes to stop the spread of infection before it reached the torso, where it would become fatal, performing these surgeries with saws and cauterizing irons in castle chambers that served as improvised operating rooms. They did not, however, recommend heating the servants' quarters as a preventive measure that would eliminate winter rot entirely, because suggesting changes to the thermal hierarchy was not considered part of their role as physicians serving noble households. So you paid the fire fees despite the debt because the alternative was documented death rather than theoretical discomfort. You borrowed money when you had to because freezing was not an option that allowed for survival. And you endured the debt burden because death seemed worse than perpetual economic bondage. The castle employment records from this period provide statistical evidence that makes this choice clear, showing mortality rates that vary dramatically by position and correlate perfectly with thermal exposure. Kitchen servants experienced 12% annual mortality, meaning that in any given year, 12 out of every 100 kitchen workers died from all causes combined, including cold-related illness, accidents, and general poor health exacerbated by working conditions. Outdoor servants who worked in stables, yards, and on walls experienced 40% annual mortality, meaning that 4 out of every 10 workers in these positions died within a single year, creating a death rate so high that modern observers struggle to comprehend how the system continued to function. Nobles living in the same castles during the same winters experienced only 3% annual mortality, meaning that 97 out of every 100 aristocrats survived each year, creating a mortality gap of more than 13 times between the highest and lowest social classes. The difference correlating most strongly with these mortality gaps was not age, not prior health status, not even nutrition, but rather sustained sleeping temperature, with colder sleeping conditions producing exponentially higher death rates. This mortality gap was not hidden in confidential documents or concealed from castle administrators, but rather written in the same ledgers that recorded wages and fire fees, appearing as simple demographic facts that stewards used for workforce planning. The castle steward who reviewed these numbers knew that hiring 10 stable boys in October meant that 4 would be dead by March, and he hired accordingly, requesting 12 or 13 new workers rather than 10 to account for the expected winter attrition. The stable master knew to hire extra hands in October because by March half would be gone through death or disability, and this foreknowledge was not based on superstition or guesswork, but on documented patterns that repeated year after year with statistical reliability. This was not callousness born of ignorance or cruelty stemming from personal sadism, but rather workforce planning based on documented thermal attrition rates that were treated as immutable facts of nature rather than as human-created conditions that could potentially be changed through different resource allocation. The payment system reveals the daily mechanics of survival and economic extraction with granular detail that shows how theory became practice in thousands of individual transactions. Each morning, the kitchen master maintained a mental ledger of who had paid the previous night and who had not, tracking perhaps 80 individual servants through memory alone because there was no written record for individual nightly transactions. Creating such documentation would have required literacy skills that most kitchen staff lacked and administrative effort that no one considered worth the trouble for tracking servant sleeping arrangements. Instead, the system operated on immediate memory and direct exchange, with you approaching the kitchen master before the evening fires were banked to complete the transaction for that night's warmth. You handed him 3 pennies if you had managed to earn, save, or borrow that amount, and he nodded while indicating your sleeping spot near the coals with a gesture that confirmed your payment and your right to occupy warm space. You did not hand him 3 pennies if you did not have them, standing empty-handed before him in a moment that communicated your poverty more clearly than any words could, and he pointed to the hallway, without ceremony or explanation because none was needed. This transaction happened approximately 80 times each night in a large castle kitchen with a full staff, creating a ritual of economic sorting that separated those who could pay from those who could not before every single sleep period. The kitchen master collected perhaps 15 to 20 payments on an average winter night, when some servants were too poor to pay, but others had borrowed or saved enough, and this meant he accumulated 45 to 60 pennies per week just from fire access fees. 180 to 240 pennies per month flowed through his hands in these small nightly transactions, creating an income stream that dwarfed his official wage. His recorded wage from the castle administration was 5 to 8 pennies per month, depending on seniority and specific castle, but his actual income from fire fees was 30 to 40 times larger than this official amount, transforming him from a fellow servant into someone who controlled significant financial resources. The castle lords who employed these kitchen masters knew about this income disparity and actively approved of it as an elegant solution to multiple administrative problems. A kitchen master who earned only his official wage of 5 to 8 pennies per month would have no personal incentive to manage the fire access system with the rigor required to maintain thermal scarcity, and would likely just let all servants sleep near the fire in an egalitarian arrangement that would create overcrowding around the coals and reduce the effective lifespan of the banked fires. By allowing the kitchen master to charge fees and keep all the proceeds as personal income, the Lord created an incentive structure that aligned the kitchen master's economic interest with the castle's administrative goals. The kitchen master became an enforcer of thermal scarcity who had a direct financial reason to limit access, to charge prices high enough to exclude the poorest servants, and to maintain the system with consistency night after night for years. The Lord did not have to increase the kitchen master's official wage, did not have to allocate any additional coal for servant heating, and did not have to personally manage the servants' sleeping arrangements or deal with disputes about who deserved warmth. The kitchen master did all of this management work himself, self-motivated by the profit he extracted from his fellow servants, creating a system that appeared to run automatically once the proper incentives were established. This was considered efficient administration by medieval standards, representing a sophisticated understanding of how financial incentives could be used to delegate management responsibilities without increasing direct costs. The cost of the entire system was extracted from servants who could least afford it rather than from the Lord's treasury, making it effectively free from the perspective of castle finances while generating significant economic value through the additional labor that servants performed to earn or borrow the money for fire fees. This administrative efficiency came at the cost of creating a parasitic relationship between servants at different levels of the hierarchy, where the kitchen master's financial success depended on extracting maximum payment from the poorest workers in the castle. He had to maintain high prices to maximize his income, had to refuse access to those who could not pay to preserve the scarcity that justified those prices, and had to enforce these rules consistently even when doing so meant sending fellow servants to freeze in hallways where they might die. His interests diverged completely from the interests of other kitchen servants, making solidarity impossible because his prosperity required their poverty. This system fragmented any potential collective action among servants because the kitchen master functioned as a middle manager whose economic incentives aligned him with the nobles rather than with his social peers. Some kitchen servants attempted to circumvent the payment system through various creative strategies that aimed to access warmth without paying the full fee, though all of these attempts operated within the constraints of a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of circumvention. A common approach involved staying awake later than the kitchen master, waiting until he fell asleep near the coals, and then quietly moving closer to the heat source without having paid for that position, essentially stealing warmth during the hours when enforcement was impossible. But kitchen masters quickly learned this tactic and began sleeping in positions that blocked access to the warmest spots, using their own bodies as barriers that prevented unpaid servants from approaching the coals without literally climbing over them. Another strategy involved working extra hours after the official end of the workday, volunteering to clean additional pots or prepare ingredients for the next morning, and then claiming the right to sleep near the fire as compensation for this extra labor rather than as a purchased privilege. Some kitchen masters accepted this arrangement because it gave them free labor while maintaining their fire fee income from other servants. But others rejected it because it set a precedent that undermined the payment system by creating an alternative currency of labor that could substitute for money. A third approach involved forming sleeping partnerships where two servants would pool their resources to pay for one warm spot, then take turns sleeping in that position for 3 hours each while the other froze in the hallway, creating a rotation that gave each of them some warmth at half the normal cost. Kitchen masters generally tolerated this arrangement because they still received full payment for the spot, though the servants who practiced it rarely found it sustainable because 3 hours of warmth followed by 3 hours of freezing did not provide enough continuous rest to prevent long-term health deterioration. The most desperate servants occasionally attempted to create unauthorized fires in prohibited locations, gathering scraps of wood or charcoal that had fallen during the day and trying to burn them in alcoves or corners of the servants' quarters where smoke might escape through gaps in the walls. This practice was extremely dangerous because medieval buildings were largely constructed of wood and thatch despite the stone facades, and an uncontrolled fire could spread rapidly through servants' quarters into the main castle structures where nobles slept. Kitchen masters who discovered unauthorized fires responded with immediate physical violence, beating the offenders severely and sometimes breaking their fingers to prevent them from gathering fuel again. The castle administration supported this violence because the fire risk to noble quarters justified any level of force used to prevent it. Several documented cases from this period involve servants being executed for creating unauthorized fires that endangered castle structures, with the executions serving as public demonstrations that reinforced the principle that warmth was a privilege to be purchased rather than a right. Several documented cases from this period involve servants being executed for creating unauthorized fires that endangered castle structures, with the executions serving as public demonstrations that reinforced the principle that warmth was a privilege to be purchased rather than a right to be taken. The only servants who largely avoided the fire payment system were those who worked directly for the kitchen master himself, functioning as his personal assistants and receiving warmth as part of their compensation rather than as a purchased commodity. These positions were extremely limited, usually numbering only 2 or 3 in even a large castle kitchen, and were allocated based on personal loyalty rather than competence or need. A servant who wanted to become the kitchen master's assistant needed to demonstrate absolute obedience over years of service, performing favors without being asked, informing on other servants who circumvented rules, and showing willingness to enforce the payment system against their friends and family members. The kitchen master rewarded this loyalty by allowing his assistants to sleep near him without payment, effectively giving them a wage increase without spending money. This created a small privileged class among kitchen servants, distinguished not by their official position or wage, but by their exemption from fire fees. And this exemption was understood by everyone as payment for collaboration in maintaining the system that oppressed other servants. The physical arrangement of sleeping spaces in castle kitchens reflected and reinforced the payment hierarchy with spatial precision that made economic status immediately visible to anyone who entered the room. The warmest spots, located within 5 to 10 feet of the banked coals, were occupied by servants who paid 3 pennies per week, and these positions were marked by smooth, worn patches on the stone floor where bodies had lain in the same location night after night for years. The middle distance positions, located 10 to 20 feet from the heat source, showed less, where because servants rotated through them more frequently as their economic fortunes fluctuated, and these spaces represented the unstable middle ground between survival and crisis. The hallway held no worn spots at all because servants assigned there could not stay still long enough to create impressions in the stone, instead spending the night shifting position constantly in a futile attempt to generate warmth through movement. A person entering the kitchen before dawn could immediately identify each servant's economic status based on their sleeping location, with social hierarchy made visible through thermal geography. This spatial arrangement was not accidental but carefully designed to maximize the efficiency of heat distribution while maintaining clear boundaries between payment categories. The kitchen master controlled the entire system by positioning himself at the warmest spot, using his body as a physical barrier between the coals and the sleeping servants, ensuring that no one could access the heat without his permission. He could observe the entire sleeping area from this position, monitoring compliance with payment rules and detecting any attempts to move closer to the warmth without authorization. The spatial design embodied the economic logic of the system, translating abstract relationships of debt and payment into concrete physical arrangements that reinforce themselves through the simple reality of heat dissipation. The annual cycle of fire payments created seasonal patterns of debt and survival that structured the entire year for kitchen servants. Autumn was the season of borrowing, when servants who had survived the summer without fire expenses suddenly needed to secure loans to cover the coming winter's warmth costs. Interest rates rose in October and November as demand for borrowed money increased, and supply remained limited because only a handful of servants had managed to accumulate savings during the warmer months. By December, the borrowing season ended because anyone who did not already have money or access to credit simply accepted that they would freeze, and the winter became a test of endurance rather than an economic negotiation. January and February represented the coldest months when fire access fees consumed the largest portion of servant income and when mortality rates peaked among outdoor servants who had no option to pay for warmth. March brought the first signs of spring and some reduction in temperature extremes, but fire fees continued because nighttime temperatures still dropped below freezing and because kitchen masters saw no reason to reduce prices as long as servants would pay them. April and May finally brought consistent warmth that made fire access unnecessary, ending the payment season until the next autumn, but also beginning the repayment season when servants who had borrowed in October and November now had to pay back their debts plus interest. June, July, and August were theoretically months when servants could accumulate savings by living on their two-penny wage without fire expenses. But in practice, most servants spent these months repaying old debts rather than preparing for new ones, meaning they entered each autumn in essentially the same financial position as the previous year. This annual cycle trapped servants in perpetual debt because the system was designed to prevent accumulation of savings even during the months when fire was not needed. A servant who borrowed 5 pennies in October to survive through March would still owe 6 pennies in April after winter ended, and repaying that debt at 2 pennies per month meant working all of April, May, and June just to clear the obligation. July, August, and September theoretically allowed for saving 6 pennies total if the servant spent nothing on anything else, but in practice servants needed to eat more than the scraps provided by the castle kitchen, needed to repair their clothing and tools, and needed to deal with occasional expenses like medical treatment or family obligations. By the time October arrived again, most servants had managed to save perhaps 3 or 4 pennies at most, which was not enough to cover the 12 pennies needed for winter fire access, forcing them to borrow again at the same or higher interest rates. The compounding nature of this debt meant that servants who lived long enough to work for 10 or 15 years often owed more money at the end of their service than they had earned in total wages during that entire period. A servant who worked for 12 years at 2 pennies per month would earn 288 pennies total, but if they borrowed 5 pennies each autumn and paid 20% interest, they would accumulate debt faster than they could repay it, potentially ending their career owing 300 or more pennies despite having worked continuously. This mathematical impossibility was not a bug in the system, but a feature that ensured servants could never accumulate enough money to leave, buy land, or establish independent livelihoods, keeping them bound to castle service through debt even more effectively than legal restrictions could have done. The psychological impact of this perpetual debt cannot be measured in medieval sources because servants were not asked about their emotional states and did not leave written records of their feelings, but the system clearly produced a kind of learned helplessness where escape seemed impossible and resistance seemed futile. Servants understood the mathematics of their situation, understood that they were paying more than they earned, understood that the debt would never disappear, and yet continued working because the alternative was immediate death from exposure or starvation. This combination of perfect knowledge and complete powerlessness defined the servant experience, creating a population that was neither ignorant nor passive, but simply trapped by circumstances they could understand but not change. The few servants who did manage to escape this system generally did so through extraordinary circumstances rather than through saving and planning. A servant might be selected by a noble to accompany them to another household, leaving the fire debt behind, but entering a new set of obligations in a different location. A servant might inherit a small piece of land from a distant relative, gaining the minimum resources needed to establish an independent existence outside castle service. A servant might marry into a family with slightly more resources, pooling their poverty with someone else's poverty to create enough combined income to survive independently. Or a servant might die, which was by far the most common exit from the system, ending the debt and the labor simultaneously in a way that benefited no one, but at least stopped the accumulation of additional suffering. The lords who owned these castles and who ultimately profited from the fire payment system did not personally collect the money or directly manage the thermal economy, but they designed the wage structure and approved the customs that made the entire arrangement possible. They set servant wages at 2 pennies per month, knowing that this amount was insufficient for survival. They allocated coal for cooking, but not for servant heating, knowing that this created scarcity. And they empowered kitchen masters to charge fees, knowing that this would create a parasitic relationship between servants at different levels of the hierarchy. These decisions were not made thoughtlessly or out of personal cruelty, but rather as part of a calculated economic strategy that minimized labor costs while maintaining a stable workforce. The key insight driving this strategy was that servants trapped by debt could not leave even when working conditions were terrible, creating a captive labor force that would accept wages below subsistence level because they had no alternative. If servants could accumulate savings and leave, lords would have to pay higher wages to attract replacement workers. But if servants were kept in perpetual debt through the fire payment system, they would continue working at starvation wages indefinitely, because debt bondage constrained their options more effectively than legal serfdom could have done. This system was economically rational from the lord's perspective because it minimized his direct costs while maximizing the labor he could extract from each servant. The broader economic context of medieval Europe made this system possible and sustainable despite its obvious cruelty. Labor was abundant because population growth had recovered from earlier plagues and famines, creating competition for positions even in terrible working conditions. Alternative employment opportunities were limited because most people lacked the skills, capital, or connections needed to establish independent livelihoods outside feudal service. The legal system enforced debt obligations rigorously while providing almost no protection for servant rights, making debt bondage a legitimate and enforceable mechanism of social control. And the ideological framework of medieval Christianity justified hierarchy and suffering as natural and divinely ordained, preventing the development of collective resistance or demands for systemic change. All of these factors combined to create a system where thermal inequality could be maintained openly, documented carefully, and enforced consistently for centuries without provoking rebellion or reform. The servants knew they were being exploited, the lords knew they were exploiting them, and everyone understood that this was how the world worked. The system persisted not because people were unaware of the injustice, but because the people with power to change it had no incentive to do so, and the people who suffered under it had no power to force change. This chronicle has examined the mechanics of thermal inequality in medieval castles with specific focus on the fire payment system that turned warmth into a commodity and sleep into a privilege purchased through debt. The details are particular to this time and place, but the underlying logic appears in many historical periods and many different economic systems. The logic of extracting maximum value at minimum cost, of binding labor through debt, of maintaining hierarchy through differential access to basic survival resources, of creating parasitic relationships between workers at different levels to prevent solidarity. This logic is not unique to medieval Europe, but rather represents a pattern that recurs whenever power is distributed unequally and economic systems are designed by those who benefit from exploitation. The broader implications of this thermal payment system extended beyond individual survival into the structure of medieval social relations and the nature of power itself. When warmth became a commodity that could be purchased rather than a basic necessity provided to all workers, it transformed the relationship between lords and servants from one of reciprocal obligation into one of pure economic extraction. Traditional feudal ideology claimed that lords protected servants and provided for their basic needs in exchange for labor and loyalty, creating a paternalistic framework that justified hierarchy while imposing certain obligations on those with power. But the fire payment system violated this ideological framework by forcing servants to purchase their own survival from wages that were deliberately set too low to cover those purchases, revealing that the lord's obligation to provide for servants was a fiction that disappeared whenever economic extraction proved more profitable than paternalistic protection. This revelation had corrosive effects on the ideological justifications for feudal hierarchy because it made the exploitative nature of the system visible to everyone involved. Servants could not believe they were being protected when they were simultaneously being charged for warmth, and lords could not claim they were fulfilling their obligations when their servants froze in hallways because they could not afford fire access fees. The system required everyone to accept a level of cognitive dissonance where the stated ideology and the actual practice diverged completely, and this divergence was so obvious that no one could pretend ignorance. The account books documented the contradiction in precise numerical form, showing wages too low and fees too high in the same ledgers that recorded the lord's income and expenses, making the exploitation a matter of written record rather than oral complaint or subjective interpretation. The persistence of the system despite this ideological contradiction suggests that ideology was less important to maintaining feudal hierarchy than raw economic power and the absence of alternatives. Lords did not need servants to believe in the justice of the system. They only needed servants to lack the power to leave or resist, and the fire payment system accomplished this goal through debt bondage that made departure economically impossible. A servant who owed 20 pennies could not leave because they would be pursued for debt, could not pay off the debt because they earned only 2 pennies per month, and could not refuse to work because that would mean starvation and exposure. The mathematics of the situation created a trap that functioned independently of ideology, belief, or consent, operating purely through economic constraint. This shift from ideological to economic control represented an early form of what would later develop into wage labor under capitalism, where workers are free in the legal sense, but bound by economic necessity in the practical sense. Medieval servants were not legally free in the way modern workers are, but the fire payment system introduced a mechanism of control that functioned through debt and wages rather than through legal status or personal obligation. A servant trapped by fire debt was not meaningfully freer than a serf bound to the land, but the mechanism of their bondage was different, operating through economic relationships rather than legal restrictions. This difference would become more important over time as legal serfdom gradually disappeared, but economic bondage persisted and expanded, eventually becoming the dominant form of labor control in capitalist societies. The psychological experience of living under this system must have been profoundly alienating for servants who could clearly see the injustice but could not escape it. They knew they earned 2 pennies and paid 12 pennies for fire access. They knew the mathematics made escape impossible. They knew the kitchen master profited from their poverty, and they knew the lords designed the entire system deliberately. This knowledge without power created a specific kind of suffering that went beyond physical cold and hunger to include the mental anguish of understanding your own exploitation while being unable to stop it. Modern psychological research on learned helplessness shows that people who understand they are trapped often suffer more than people who believe their situation might improve, because the combination of knowledge and powerlessness produces depression, anxiety, and a sense of futility that undermines even basic coping mechanisms. Medieval servants had no access to psychological frameworks that would allow them to understand their suffering in these terms, but they certainly experienced the emotional consequences of sustained powerlessness in the face of obvious injustice. Some probably developed the kind of fatalistic acceptance that allows people to endure unbearable conditions by treating them as inevitable, while others likely maintained anger and resentment that had no outlet except occasional small acts of resistance or rebellion. A few might have found ways to maintain hope despite the odds, believing that they or their children might somehow escape the system, though this hope was almost certainly unfounded given the mathematical impossibility of repaying compounding debt on starvation wages. The social relationships among servants were inevitably shaped by the fire payment system in ways that prevented solidarity and collective resistance. When the kitchen master earned 30 to 40 times his official wage by charging fire fees to other servants, his interests diverged completely from theirs, making him an enforcer of the system rather than a fellow victim. When servants competed for the warmest sleeping spots through payment, they were set against each other in a zero-sum game, where one person's warmth came at the cost of another person's exclusion. When some servants borrowed from others at 20% interest, they created creditor-debtor relationships that divided them into opposing economic camps. All of these relationships fragmented the servant community and prevented the development of collective consciousness or organized resistance that might have challenged the system. This fragmentation was not accidental, but was built into the structure of the system as a mechanism of control. By allowing the kitchen master to profit from fire fees, lords created a middle layer of servants whose economic interests aligned with maintaining thermal scarcity rather than challenging it. By pricing fire access at levels that only some servants could afford, lords ensured competition for warm spots that prevented servants from recognizing their common interests. By encouraging servants to lend money to each other at interest, lords promoted the development of internal hierarchies based on accumulated savings that further divided the servant community. Each of these features made collective action less likely because servants who might have united against the lords were instead focused on negotiating with, competing against, or exploiting each other. The few instances of servant resistance that appear in medieval records suggest that when collective action did occur, it was quickly and violently suppressed through mechanisms that demonstrate how seriously lords took the threat of organized opposition. In one documented case from a castle in northern England, a group of kitchen servants attempted to collectively refuse to pay fire fees, agreeing among themselves that they would all sleep in the hallways together rather than continuing to pay the kitchen master. The kitchen master reported this to the steward, who reported it to the lord, and the lord responded by having the 10 servants identified as ringleaders publicly whipped in the courtyard, then dismissed from service without references or back wages. The remaining servants immediately resumed paying fire fees, and the incident was recorded in the castle accounts as a disciplinary expense, with no commentary suggesting that anyone viewed the servants' action as justified or their punishment as excessive. This violent response to even limited collective action demonstrates that lords understood their system depended on preventing servants from organizing together, and they were willing to use extreme force to maintain that fragmentation. The whipping and dismissal of 10 servants represented a significant economic loss because training replacements took time and reduced productivity. But the lord clearly considered this cost worthwhile to prevent the spread of collective resistance that might threaten the entire system. The fact that this single incident of collective refusal appears in the records suggests that such resistance was rare enough to be noteworthy, which in turn suggests that the system's mechanisms of fragmentation and control were generally effective at preventing organization. The economic logic underlying the fire payment system also reveals how lords calculated the value of servant lives and made decisions about resource allocation based on those calculations. When a lord set servant wages at 2 pennies per month, knowing that fire access cost 12 pennies per month, he was making an implicit calculation that the value of a servant's life was less than the cost of providing them with warmth. If keeping all servants warm would have cost more than replacing dead servants with new workers, then allowing some servants to freeze made economic sense from the lord's perspective. The mortality statistics support this interpretation because the 40% annual death rate among outdoor servants who had no access to purchased warmth was clearly acceptable to lords who continued employing workers in those positions without providing heating. This calculation became more complex when considering the costs of training and the disruption caused by high turnover, but medieval labor markets provided abundant replacement workers with minimal training requirements for most servant positions. A stable boy or kitchen scullion could be trained in a few weeks, making the individual worker easily replaceable even if their death rate was very high. The positions that required more skill and training, such as the kitchen master or the head cook, were generally paid better and had access to warmth, suggesting that lords did make some effort to preserve valuable workers while accepting high mortality among unskilled labor. This differential treatment based on skill and replaceability demonstrates that servant deaths were not random tragedies, but predictable outcomes of economic calculations that lords made explicitly when allocating resources. The archives that preserve these medieval household accounts also reveal how record-keeping itself functioned as a technology of control that made exploitation more efficient and more sustainable. By documenting wages, fire fees, coal allocations, and mortality rates, stewards created information systems that allowed lords to optimize their extraction of value from servants. The accounts showed exactly how much coal was needed to heat noble chambers, how much servants could be charged for fire access without provoking rebellion, how many replacement workers needed to be hired to compensate for winter deaths, and how the entire system balanced financially over annual cycles. This information allowed lords to fine-tune the system, adjusting wages and fees to maximize profit while maintaining a stable workforce, treating human labor as a managed resource to be optimized through data analysis. The precision of this record-keeping also served an ideological function by presenting exploitation as rational administration rather than moral failure. When servant deaths appeared as percentages in annual reports rather than as individual human tragedies, they became abstract numbers that could be analyzed and accepted without emotional engagement. When the gap between wages and survival costs appeared as line items in balanced accounts, it became an administrative detail rather than a moral outrage. The form of the documentation transformed exploitation from a human relationship involving suffering and power into a technical problem involving efficiency and optimization, making it easier for everyone involved to participate in the system without confronting its ethical implications. Modern historians who study these archives must resist this same ideological effect by remembering that every number represents human suffering and every balanced account conceals structural violence. When we read that kitchen servants earned 2 pennies per month and paid 12 pennies for fire access, we must understand that this means real people went cold, accumulated unpayable debt, and died from exposure because of deliberately designed economic structures. When we see 40% annual mortality rates among outdoor servants, we must recognize that this means 4 out of every 10 workers died each year in conditions that could have been changed through different resource allocation. The archives document exploitation with bureaucratic precision, but we must read them with moral clarity that recognizes the human cost behind the numbers. The comparison between medieval thermal inequality and modern economic inequality reveals both continuities and changes in how systems of exploitation function across historical periods. The specific mechanism has changed from fire access fees to rent, from wages in pennies to wages in dollars, from castle service to wage labor, but the underlying logic persists in recognizable forms. Workers today often pay more for housing than they earn in wages, creating the same mathematical impossibility that trapped medieval servants in fire debt. Just as medieval servants earned 2 pennies and owed 12 pennies for warmth, modern workers might earn $2,000 and owe $1,500 for rent plus utilities, leaving them in perpetual deficit that compounds over time through credit card debt and payday loans. The mechanisms of fragmentation also show remarkable continuity, with modern workers divided against each other through competition for positions, differential pay scales, and hierarchies that align some workers' interests with management rather than with other workers. Just as the medieval kitchen master profited from charging fire fees to other servants, modern middle managers often receive bonuses for reducing labor costs by suppressing wages or eliminating positions, creating economic incentives that prevent solidarity across organizational hierarchies. Just as medieval servants competed for warm sleeping spots through payment, modern workers compete for scarce positions through credential accumulation and geographic mobility that individualize what could be collective struggles. The ideological justifications have also evolved while maintaining the same essential function of presenting exploitation as natural, inevitable, or justified by abstract principles. Medieval lords claimed that hierarchy was divinely ordained and that servants owed labor and obedience in exchange for protection and guidance, even though the actual relationship involved charging servants for warmth they could not afford. Modern economic ideology claims that markets are natural and efficient, that wages reflect productivity, and that inequality results from differences in merit and effort, even though the actual relationship often involves extracting maximum value at minimum cost through mechanisms that trap workers in debt and poverty. Both ideological frameworks function to normalize exploitation and prevent challenges to the system by presenting what is actually a human-created structure as if it were a natural fact beyond human control. But there are also important differences between medieval and modern systems that affect how exploitation functions and how it might be resisted. Medieval servants were legally bound to their lords through feudal obligations that made departure illegal even when economically possible, while modern workers are legally free to quit and seek other employment even when economically trapped. This legal freedom matters even when economic constraint makes it largely theoretical, because it creates political and ideological openings that did not exist under feudalism. Medieval servants could not demand rights or organize unions without challenging the entire legal structure that defined them as subordinate, while modern workers can sometimes use democratic political institutions or labor laws to constrain employer power without overthrowing the entire system. The scale of economic organization has also changed dramatically, with medieval castle economies involving dozens or hundreds of people in relatively isolated systems, while modern capitalism involves billions of people in globally integrated markets. This increased scale creates new vulnerabilities for exploitation because workers can be easily replaced by others in distant locations. But it also creates new possibilities for resistance because organizing can potentially happen across national boundaries and involve millions of people simultaneously. The same technologies that allow capital to coordinate globally also allow workers to communicate and organize globally, creating tactical opportunities that did not exist in the medieval period when coordination was limited by distance and communication speed. The relationship between economic and political power has become more complex and potentially more contestable in modern democratic societies compared to medieval feudalism, where the same people held both forms of power with no institutional separation. Modern corporations have enormous economic power but do not directly control political institutions in the way that medieval lords controlled both the economy and the legal system, creating at least theoretical space for political challenges to economic exploitation. Workers can vote, form political parties, lobby for labor laws, and use democratic institutions to constrain corporate power in ways that would have been literally unthinkable in the medieval period when political participation was restricted to a tiny aristocratic elite. These differences suggest that while the underlying logic of exploitation shows remarkable continuity across historical periods, the specific mechanisms and the possibilities for resistance have changed in ways that matter. Medieval servants had almost no options beyond individual endurance or escape because the legal, economic, and ideological structures all reinforced each other with no gaps or contradictions that could be exploited for change. Modern workers face systems that are equally exploitative in their logic but more contradictory in their implementation, with gaps between legal rights and economic reality, between democratic ideology and oligarchic practice, and between global coordination of capital and fragmented organization of labor. These contradictions create opportunities for resistance that did not exist in more tightly integrated feudal systems. Though whether those opportunities can be successfully exploited remains an open question that depends on collective action rather than individual agency. The chroniclers who documented medieval thermal inequality did so without apparent moral discomfort, recording servant deaths and fire access fees with the same neutral precision they applied to coal purchases and wage payments. This suggests that exploitation can become so normalized within a culture that even those who document it fail to recognize it as problematic, instead treating it as unremarkable administrative detail. The steward who wrote that kitchen servants paid more for fire access than they earned in wages was not making a moral critique, but simply recording a fact that he considered as natural as the changing of seasons. The lord who reviewed these accounts and saw 40% annual mortality among outdoor servants did not see evidence of a system that should be changed, but rather information useful for workforce planning that should be incorporated into future hiring decisions. This normalization of exploitation through documentation and routine administrative practice represents one of the most effective mechanisms for sustaining unjust systems over long periods. When everyone involved treats exploitation as normal business practice rather than moral failure, it becomes very difficult to generate the collective outrage necessary for systemic change. The servants who suffered could see the injustice clearly, but they were not asked their opinion and did not have access to the mechanisms of documentation and official discourse that shaped how the system was understood. The lords and stewards who controlled those mechanisms presented exploitation as rational administration, and this presentation became the official record that historians now study centuries later. Breaking through this normalization requires deliberate effort to read historical sources against their own assumptions, recognizing that what documents present as normal may actually be evidence of structural violence that the powerful found convenient to ignore. The medieval household accounts that calmly record fire access fees and servant mortality rates are not neutral records, but rather documents created by and for the powerful to manage their exploitation of the powerless. Reading them critically means recognizing that the precision and rationality of the documentation itself served an ideological function, making exploitation appear as efficient administration rather than as moral failure requiring correction. This same critical reading must be applied to contemporary economic documentation, which presents poverty, inequality, and exploitation in the neutral language of statistics, market forces, and efficiency metrics. When modern economic reports document that workers cannot afford housing on minimum wage, or that certain industries have high injury rates, or that certain populations experience significantly lower life expectancy, they are documenting exploitation with the same bureaucratic precision that medieval stewards used to record servant mortality and fire access fees. The neutral presentation makes it easy to accept these facts as inevitable rather than as evidence of systems designed to extract value at the cost of human suffering. The physical layout of castle architecture was deliberately designed to maintain thermal hierarchy through structural features that made heat distribution unequal even before the fire payment system added economic barriers to warmth. Noble chambers were located on upper floors where rising heat from lower cooking fires provided passive warming, positioned in interior locations protected from external walls where cold penetrated most directly, and equipped with fireplaces connected to chimneys that drew efficiently enough to maintain comfortable temperatures without filling rooms with smoke. These architectural choices represented conscious decisions about how to allocate the benefits of fire throughout the building, with nobles receiving the best thermal positions through design features built into the castle structure itself rather than through temporary arrangements that could be changed seasonally. Servant quarters, by contrast, were located in positions that maximized thermal disadvantage through every architectural element. Kitchen servants slept in ground floor rooms or basement areas where cold from the earth below penetrated constantly, positioned along external walls where wind created drafts through gaps in stone that no amount of mortar could completely seal, and provided with no fireplaces or chimneys because the expense of adding these features to servant areas was considered unjustifiable when servants could not afford fuel anyway. The positioning of servants in thermally disadvantaged locations was not an accidental result of space constraints, but a deliberate choice that reflected social hierarchy through architectural form, with the building itself embodying the principle that nobles deserved warmth while servants deserved cold. The thickness of walls varied by function and location in ways that reinforced this thermal hierarchy, with noble chambers built with walls 2 to 3 feet thick that provided substantial insulation against external temperature changes, while servant areas had walls only 1 to 1.5 feet thick that allowed heat to escape rapidly and cold to penetrate easily. This difference in wall thickness represented a significant allocation of construction resources, with each additional foot of wall thickness requiring exponentially more stone and labor to build. Lords chose to invest these resources in noble chambers while economizing on servant quarters, making a calculated decision that thermal comfort for the powerful justified substantial expense, while thermal survival for the powerless did not merit even basic insulation. Windows followed the same pattern of differential investment, with noble chambers equipped with shutters made of thick oak that could be closed against winter wind, while still allowing some light to enter through gaps in the wood, and in some wealthy castles, glazed windows that provided complete wind protection while allowing full light transmission. Servant quarters, when they had windows at all, received only unglazed openings that had to be either blocked completely with cloth or wood during winter or left open to admit freezing wind along with light. The glazed windows in noble chambers represented enormous expense, with glass being imported from Venice or other specialized production centers at costs that exceeded annual servant wages, making the choice to install them a clear statement about whose thermal comfort justified luxury expenditure. The floors of noble chambers were covered with rushes that provided insulation against cold rising from stone, replaced frequently enough to maintain their effectiveness and supplemented with imported carpets in the wealthiest households. Servant sleeping areas had bare stone floors that conducted cold directly into any body lying on them, with no provision for rushes or any other form of insulation because the cost of replacing rushes in servant quarters was considered wasteful when servants were expected to endure discomfort. This difference in flooring created dramatically different thermal experiences even when room temperatures were identical, with nobles insulated from the coldest surface while servants were in direct contact with stone that could drop to freezing temperatures during winter nights. The ceiling heights in different areas of the castle also affected thermal distribution in ways that advantaged nobles and disadvantaged servants. Noble chambers had relatively low ceilings that kept warm air close to the living space and reduced the volume of air that needed to be heated, while great halls had very high ceilings that allowed heat to rise far above the occupied zone, creating spectacular visual effects but terrible thermal efficiency. Servant quarters often had high ceilings because they were located in spaces originally designed for storage or other functions rather than habitation, meaning that any heat generated in these rooms immediately rose to the ceiling where it provided no benefit to people sleeping on the floor. The seasonal variation in castle thermal conditions created different patterns of suffering and adaptation for servants who had to navigate changing temperatures without changing access to resources. Autumn brought the first cold nights when servants began negotiating for fire access, but temperatures were still mild enough that sleeping in hallways caused discomfort rather than immediate danger, creating a period when servants who chose to save money by freezing could do so without risking death. This autumn period functioned as a kind of testing ground where servants learned which positions in the hallways were least cold, which corners trapped less wind, and which arrangements of bodies allowed for some shared warmth, developing knowledge that would become crucial for survival when winter temperatures made fire access a matter of life or death. Winter proper began when nighttime temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there for weeks or months at a time, creating conditions where sleeping without fire access meant guaranteed frostbite and likely death from prolonged cold exposure. This was the season when fire access payments peaked, when borrowing increased dramatically, and when the mathematics of the system became most brutally clear because there was no longer any option to economize by enduring cold. You paid the kitchen master or you died, and the choice was that simple and that stark, eliminating any possibility of resistance through refusal because the alternative to payment was not merely discomfort but certain death. The deepest winter cold, typically in January and February, sometimes made even paid fire access insufficient for comfort because the banked coals in the kitchen could not maintain enough heat to warm large numbers of servants when outdoor temperatures dropped to their lowest points. During these periods, servants who had paid full price for premium positions near the coals still shivered through the night, though they shivered at 5 degrees Celsius rather than the negative 5 degrees Celsius that outdoor servants experienced. The inadequacy of purchased warmth during extreme cold revealed that the system was designed to extract payment rather than to provide adequate heating, with prices set to maximize revenue rather than to ensure survival. Spring brought gradual warming that allowed servants to reduce their fire access payments. But this warming happened slowly and unpredictably, with cold snaps returning well into April or even May in northern European climates. Kitchen masters maintained high prices throughout this transitional period, arguing that cold could return at any time and that servants still needed access to fire as insurance against unexpected temperature drops. Servants who tried to economize by stopping payments in March often found themselves freezing during late cold snaps, then having to pay emergency rates to regain fire access for a few crucial nights, creating opportunities for kitchen masters to charge premium prices during what should have been a declining season for fire fees. Summer eliminated the need for fire access entirely except in the coldest northern castles. But this was also the season when servants had to repay winter debts, meaning that the elimination of fire expenses did not create surplus income, but rather allowed for debt service. The summer months represented a breathing period when the immediate threat of freezing disappeared, but the economic pressure remained through debt obligations that consumed any potential savings, ensuring that servants entered each autumn in essentially the same financial position as the previous year despite having worked continuously for 12 months. The relationship between temperature, mortality, and debt created a positive feedback loop where cold created debt, debt created poverty, and poverty created vulnerability to cold that increased mortality and created more opportunities for debt. Servants who managed to avoid borrowing in year one had a better chance of surviving year two because they started without debt, but any servant who was forced to borrow once became trapped in a cycle where debt service consumed their income, preventing them from paying fire fees directly, forcing them to borrow more, and creating an ever-expanding obligation that could never be repaid through normal wages. This feedback loop meant that the servant population gradually divided into those who had never borrowed and might maintain independence, and those who had borrowed once and would almost certainly die in debt. The kitchen masters who profited from this system accumulated wealth that was extraordinary by servant standards though trivial compared to noble fortunes, allowing them to establish a kind of middle status between ordinary servants and minor nobility. A kitchen master who collected 200 pennies per month from fire fees could, over several years, accumulate enough money to purchase a small piece of land, make advantageous marriages for their children, or even leave castle service entirely to establish independent households. This possibility of upward mobility, however limited, created an incentive for kitchen servants to aspire to the master position, competing for the Lord's favor in hopes of eventually being promoted to the role that would allow them to exploit other servants in turn. The competition for kitchen master positions functioned as another mechanism of social control, creating divisions among servants who might otherwise have recognized their common interests and organized collectively. Servants who wanted promotion demonstrated their loyalty by informing on other servants, by enforcing rules strictly even against friends and family, and by showing willingness to prioritize the Lord's interests over servant solidarity. The Lord benefited from this competition because it meant he always had willing enforcers who would maintain the fire payment system without requiring supervision or additional compensation from the Lord's treasury. The few servants who achieved promotion to kitchen master and accumulated significant savings rarely used that wealth to leave the system entirely, but instead used it to secure better positions within the same hierarchy. A kitchen master might purchase a minor administrative role in the castle bureaucracy, moving from direct service into record-keeping or supply management, positions that paid less than kitchen master fire fees, but carried higher social status and required less physical labor. This pattern meant that successful servants did not escape the system, but instead became more deeply integrated into it at a higher level, with their economic success depending on the continuation of exploitation rather than its elimination. The broader economic system of medieval England and northern France created conditions that made thermal extraction possible and profitable for lords who understood how to implement it systematically. The abundance of labor meant that lords did not need to worry about attracting workers through high wages or good conditions because unemployed people desperately sought any position regardless of terms. The absence of alternative employment opportunities meant that servants could not leave bad situations for better ones because there were no better situations available to most people without specialized skills or capital. The legal framework enforced debt obligations while providing almost no protection for servant rights, making it possible to pursue servants for unpaid debts while giving servants no legal recourse for wages too low to survive or working conditions that threaten health. The ideological context of medieval Christianity reinforced this system by teaching that suffering in this life was preparation for reward in the afterlife, that hierarchy was divinely ordained and should not be questioned, and that the poor should accept their station with humility rather than demanding justice or change. Priests who served castle chapels delivered sermons explaining that servants who suffered in this life would receive comfort in heaven, while nobles who enjoyed comfort now might face punishment later, creating a narrative that encouraged servants to endure exploitation without resistance. This religious ideology was probably more important than physical force in maintaining the system, because it meant that most servants accepted their suffering as natural and inevitable rather than recognizing it as the result of human choices that could potentially be altered. The periodic famines, plagues, and economic disruptions that affected medieval Europe created temporary shifts in the labor market that sometimes improved servant bargaining power but never fundamentally altered the thermal payment system. During periods when labor was scarce, lords sometimes increased wages or improved conditions to attract workers, but these improvements rarely extended to providing free fire access because the fire payment system generated revenue that lords were unwilling to abandon. Instead, wage increases during labor shortages were simply absorbed by price increases in fire fees, with kitchen masters raising their charges to capture the additional income that servants received, maintaining the gap between wages and survival costs at a constant level regardless of absolute wage rates. The Black Death of 1348 to 1350 killed perhaps one-third of the European population and created massive labor shortages that gave surviving servants unprecedented bargaining power, leading to wage increases and some improvement in working conditions across many sectors of the economy. But the household accounts from the period after the plague show that fire access fees increased proportionally to wages, with kitchen masters charging higher prices when servants earned more money, ensuring that the relative burden remained constant even as absolute numbers changed. This demonstrates that the fire payment system was not a response to specific economic conditions, but rather a structural feature of castle administration that adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its extractive function. The gradual decline of the fire payment system over the 14th and 15th centuries came not from moral reform or servant resistance, but from changing economic calculations as labor became more valuable and lords found it increasingly difficult to attract workers under conditions of extreme exploitation. The rise of towns and the expansion of commercial opportunities gave some servants alternatives to castle service, forcing lords to improve conditions to prevent losing workers to urban wage labor or independent farming. But this improvement was gradual, incomplete, and unevenly distributed across regions and types of employment, with some castles maintaining fire payment systems well into the 16th century while others abandoned them in the 14th. The persistence of thermal inequality even after the formal fire payment system disappeared shows that the underlying logic outlasted the specific mechanism. When lords could no longer charge explicit fees for fire access without losing workers, they instead reduced coal allocations to servant areas, provided lower quality fuel that generated less heat, or created other forms of thermal disadvantage that maintained hierarchy without requiring payment. The shift from extracting rent directly to simply providing unequal access to warmth represented a change in tactics rather than a fundamental transformation of the system, with the same basic principle of thermal inequality expressed through different administrative means. The documentary evidence we have for this system comes almost entirely from the account books that lords and stewards maintained for their own purposes, creating a record that captures the exploiter's perspective while leaving the experience of exploited servants largely invisible. We know how much servants earned, how much they paid, and how many died, but we do not know how they felt about this system, how they talked about it among themselves, or what strategies of resistance they attempted beyond the few incidents that appear in official records. This documentary bias means that our understanding of the system is inevitably shaped by the assumptions and interests of those who profited from it, with the voices of those who suffered remaining silent except as numbers in account books. Recovering the servant perspective requires reading the documents against their grain, interpreting silences and gaps as potentially meaningful, and using comparative evidence from other contexts to imagine what experiences might have been like for people who left no direct testimony. When we see that kitchen servants earned 2 pennies and paid 12 pennies for fire access, we can infer that they experienced chronic anxiety about freezing, desperation to find money, and helplessness in the face of mathematics that made survival impossible through honest labor alone. When we see that outdoor servants died at rates of 40% annually, we can infer that they lived with constant awareness of death, with grief for lost friends and coworkers, and with fear that they would be next. These inferences are not certain knowledge, but they are reasonable interpretations based on what we know about human psychology and what we can see in the cold numerical facts that the documents preserve. The challenge of historical interpretation becomes how to honor both the documentary evidence that exists and the lived experience that is largely absent from that evidence, recognizing that the numbers tell us something important about the system's structure while missing most of what mattered to the people who lived through it. The account books are valuable sources that allow us to reconstruct the fire payment system in precise detail, but they are also limited sources that present exploitation in dehumanized form as administrative data rather than as human suffering. Reading them critically means taking their numbers seriously while also recognizing what those numbers represent in terms of cold bodies, unpayable debts, and deaths that could have been prevented through different resource allocation. The moral question that emerges from studying this system is not whether medieval people were more cruel than modern people, because the evidence suggests that cruelty is not the right frame for understanding structural exploitation. The lords who designed the fire payment system were not sadists who enjoyed watching servants suffer, but rational economic actors who sought to minimize costs and maximize value extraction within a system that gave them complete power over vulnerable workers. The stewards who documented the system in careful detail were not monsters, but bureaucrats doing their jobs according to the standards and expectations of their time. The kitchen masters who charged fees and excluded freezing servants were not evil, but self-interested individuals responding to incentives that the system created. The point is not that medieval people were uniquely bad, but that ordinary people participating in systems designed to serve the powerful will produce extraordinary suffering for the powerless without necessarily recognizing that suffering as morally problematic. This recognition should make us suspicious of our own participation in contemporary systems that produce suffering we have learned not to see. We document poverty and inequality with the same bureaucratic precision that medieval stewards used to record fire access fees and servant mortality. We present exploitation in neutral language that makes it appear as administrative detail rather than moral failure. And we participate in systems that extract value from vulnerable people while maintaining ideological frameworks that present these arrangements as natural or inevitable. The distance of centuries makes it easy to recognize the injustice of the medieval fire payment system, but contemporary equivalents are harder to see because we are immersed in them, and because our cultural frameworks normalize them in ways we rarely question. The lesson from studying medieval thermal inequality is not that we should feel superior to the past, but that we should recognize the patterns that persist across historical periods, understanding that exploitation operates through similar logical structures even when specific mechanisms change. Medieval servants paid for warmth they could not afford on wages deliberately set too low, creating unpayable debt that trapped them in service. And this same pattern appears in modern contexts where people pay for housing they cannot afford on wages deliberately suppressed below subsistence levels, creating debt that traps them in exploitative employment. The resource being purchased has changed from warmth to housing. The currency has changed from pennies to dollars, but the mathematics of extraction remains the same, with survival costs exceeding wages by design rather than accident. Recognizing this continuity does not mean treating medieval and modern systems as identical, because important differences exist in legal frameworks, political possibilities, and opportunities for resistance. But it does mean understanding that the basic logic of extraction, setting survival costs higher than wages provided, using debt to bind labor, fragmenting workers to prevent solidarity, and justifying the whole arrangement through ideology that presents human design as natural necessity, is not historically unique but structurally persistent. This logic appears whenever people with power design economic systems to serve their interests at the expense of those without power, and it will continue appearing in new forms until the fundamental distribution of power changes. The servants who froze in medieval castles are gone, but the logic that froze them persists in systems that continue producing cold bodies, unpayable debts, and deaths that are foreseeable, documented, and accepted as necessary by those who benefit from the arrangements that cause them. The chroniclers wrote it all down with bureaucratic precision, and we continue writing similar things down today, recording exploitation in spreadsheets and reports that present human suffering as technical data. The challenge is learning to read these documents critically, recognizing what they reveal about systems designed to extract value at the cost of human life, and using that recognition to question our own participation in similar systems that we have learned to see as normal. This story is over, but the lesson remains relevant. Exploitation systems survive not through secrecy or ignorance, but through normalization and documentation, where injustice becomes simply an administrative practice that everyone understands but few can change.